Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for making it to this seminar. I think it's the first thing I should do is really to thank ASEC and James for the hospitality and allowing us this marvelous room, which we are going to exploit James for very often from now on. So thank you, ASEC. Secondly, I want to convey my deep appreciation to AREO for agreeing to share their insights with us, and also to Hanteng and Erika for their contributions. We're trying to keep this very informal. It's a small group, so let's not be too formal or anything like that. I think it's a timely event. AREO came up with their outlook piece a few weeks ago, but I think Catherine's going to give us an updated view of their current outlook on the Asia Pac. So it will be an updated view. And then we will get from Marty a different view, which is more on the structural, especially the three big transformations that they see shaping the landscape in our part of the world. So I think we should benefit a lot from these presentations. I have to say that over the more than decade of their existence, AREO has really established itself as one of the main observers and interpreters of Asian trends for us. And they do so, the IMF does it, the World Bank does it, the ADB does it, and each has its own characteristic style, and AREO has developed its own, which gives a very nuanced and I think quite deep understanding of issues in Asia, quite often from an Asian perspective. So I think that's been very helpful. So AREO has really become one of the go-to places for understanding what's going on in Asian economy. So I think we look forward to their views that we'll hear soon. We're going to keep this format very simple. Catherine Koh and Marty Hinoyes will be presenting their key findings first. Catherine will be looking at the conjunctural stuff, the cyclical outlook, and Marty will be looking at these three big structural shifts. Then, since it is the morning, we'll allow you to have some coffee for 15 minutes, and then we'll reconstitute the panel, and we'll have a discussion with Hanteng and Erika giving their views first, and then we'll open up to the floor. And I hope that there will be lots of questions, comments. You can object. This is a free country, so you can say what you like. But please do participate and make it lively and interactive. So with that, I think we can begin the discussion. Maybe I should ask Catherine to start. Where do you want to do it from? Okay, great, thanks. You want the... Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Manu, for that kind introduction and a brief overview of what the AREO and progress that AREO has made in the last 10 years. Before I go any further, I would first like to thank the Economic Society of Singapore and ASEC Business School for generously hosting this event with us. Now, as Manu has mentioned, my presentation is going to provide, with Marty's as well, provide an overview of what the ASEAN+3 Regional Economic Outlook, or AREO for short, has covered in this year's report. Now, the report, let me get into it. Oops, here. All right, the report consists of two chapters. Chapter 1, the conjunctural chapter, looks at more macroeconomic prospects and more short-term challenges that the region as a whole faces. And Chapter 2 then will talk about more secular challenges that might affect the region in the next few decades. Now, let me start with the near-term outlook. The short-term outlook for the region is one that is quite positive. Let me cut to the chase. They say growth is going to improve this year and is expected to moderate towards longer-term trend by next year. Inflation is going to continue moderating. So that's all good and dandy. But if we were to go down to the specific countries, we would see that, of course, Sorry, I'm going to need some help here with the next slide. All right, so this is a more detailed breakdown in terms of individual countries. Again, for this year, not much to worry about. Across the board, you would see that all economies except Japan and Myanmar are expected to see improving growth for this year. And subsequently, for 2025, we expect growth to moderate for most of the economies, actually broad-based across all our region towards their longer-term trend. On the inflation side, we will also see inflation likely to moderate this year and continue further this inflation trend towards next year. And this is mainly in line with moderating global commodity prices. Over here, we've also highlighted Singapore, and you would see that Singapore, for both GDP and also inflation, are following a similar trend as the region. Let me now go into the specific reasons underpinning our forecast. Let me start with before that, the overall outlook and what this growth trend would mean for the region is that the good news is the region as a whole will continue outpacing global growth for the remainder of this decade. That's the chart you'll be seeing on the left. And on the right, you would see that as a summary for the entire remainder of this decade, the region would contribute about 45% of global growth. It's pretty commendable performance here. But zooming into the specific reasons, again, a key factor that's underpinning our growth forecast for this year is the improvement in external demand. And there are three reasons for this. First of all, the chart that you see most on the left is the semiconductor cycle upturn. Semiconductor cycle has been undergoing a prolonged downturn that we have seen in the past 2 years. This year, we expect this trend to turn around as inventory adjustments normalize and also as we see improved demand from and this would lift growth for most of the electronic exporters in our region. And we have already seen exports turning around for some of the East Asian economies within our region. And we expect this trend to broaden to the rest of the region for the remainder of the year. Now, the second reason is in the chart in the middle here, that you would see the consumption in the US. Previously, in the last 2 years, when we've seen very strong growth in the US, we have often questioned why hasn't this translated into stronger exports for the region? And one of the reasons for this is because this trend in the US has been driven by services consumption, which doesn't directly benefit the exports for the region. The good news is that this trend is reversing, and we do see goods demand in the US picking up and outpacing services exports since the third quarter of last year. And if this trend were to continue, this would benefit exports for the region. And the last reason for our optimism on the external demand is the chart on the far right, where you would see exports of services improving. First of all is tourism's recovery. We expect that to continue and tourism to recover to its pre-pandemic levels by the end of this year, if not by early next year. And the second reason for this is also modern services. Demand for modern services, which are services that can be rendered through digital means, which is either e-commerce or professional services, which has really risen since the pandemic. It's going to sustain its demand, and that's going to support growth going forward. This is an important secular trend that we identify for the region, and it's something that we'll explore further in the second chapter. Now, besides improvement in external demand, domestic demand has remained resilient, and we expect this to be the trend going forward. The pink bar that you see on the chart on the left shows consumption for the region, and consumption has pretty much been holding up growth for the region. And the other factor that we want to look at is also investment. Investment is the bar in gray, and we see that has improved in last year, but we expect this trend to continue picking up for the remainder of the year. On the right, you would see the breakdown between ASEAN+5 and Japan and Korea. You see that the trend for investment has actually picked up and sustained pretty strongly for ASEAN+5, but less so for Japan and Korea. But we again expect this to be sustained, if not improved, going forward. This is an important trend again when it comes to investment pickup, because it was a bit of a cause of concern after the recovery from the pandemic. We were worried about whether investment can fully catch up. Now, turning to inflation, inflation has moderated from its peak in the last year, and we expect this trend to continue. But the pace of this inflation might differ. And specifically for core inflation, we expect this pace of disinflation to be slower than headline inflation. On the right, what is more interesting is that we find underlying dynamics in inflation drivers could have changed since the pandemic. In particular, supply factors have now been seen to have stronger effects on core inflation than they did previously. And if this trend is something that's going to continue, this would warrant closer look and a re-examination of how we conduct our policy making and the bigger implications it may have for macroeconomic management. But this is a very new area that we're looking at, and we're still doing research in this. Now, having covered the baseline projections for our growth and inflation, let me turn now to the risks for our region. There are 4 key risks that we identify for the short-term period, and key among this is the spike in global commodity prices. As you can see from the previous chart, inflation hasn't fully recovered to its long-term trend or hasn't really recovered to a level that everybody's comfortable at. And this is something that could still spike up if commodity prices were to surge in view of geopolitical tensions that are tense and rising every day, and also adverse weather effects on agricultural crops. The other risk that we're looking at in terms of growth is also weaker economic growth in China and also potentially the US and Europe. And a new risk that we have identified for this year compared to last year is the adverse spillover from the US presidential election. So it's not just the election itself, which is happening every year, but in the run to and policies that are being introduced as candidates try to outdo each other when it comes to policy reactions to especially trade, right? So these are some of the impact that we could potentially see impacting the region. In the longer term, some of the longer term risks that we're looking at, is geo-economic confrontations that could unravel the way trade and investments are carried out in the region right now, failure to mitigate for climate change, our aging population, cyber insecurity, and of course, we cannot rule out the occurrence of another health crisis, such as the pandemic that we saw a few years back. Now, broadly turning on to policy, the broad positive prospects for the region then allows us to consolidate policy and prepare for future resilience. On that note, for fiscal policy, we have seen broadly the chart on the left here. The yellow bar refers to contractionary or more tight policy. On the fiscal side, you see most countries are already undertaking that. And that is a policy recommendation that we do give out to the policymakers as well, that you should continue on fiscal consolidation if situation permits, but of course stand ready to support the economy if situation were to turn. On the monetary side, we see monetary policy remaining tight, and that's in line with our recommendation as well, that monetary policy should remain tight until inflation is fully entrenched. And we think this is also an opportune time for our economies to rebuild the policy space that they have lost during the pandemic. As you have seen on the chart on the right, the gross government debt for all our economies across the board has broadly increased since the pandemic. So a special feature that we do look at in our report this year is a look back at how much growth or trend growth have we lost since the pandemic. And broadly across the board, we see that trend growth has moderated since the pandemic. That's in part due to the pandemic, but also in part due to the multiple shocks that our region has faced since recovering from the pandemic. And if we were to dive into this further, and we look down in terms of the components, you would see the chart on the right that the bulk of this impact is on investment. So investment is the one that has fallen the furthest away from its trend growth, and that has not fully recovered yet. And this is an area of concern if we were to look at future growth prospects and where the region is headed in the next few years. So let me conclude. In the near term, ASEAN+3's growth is expected to in by resilient domestic demand and an improving external demand. External demand is going to be supported by an upturn in semiconductor cycle, a turnaround in US private consumption towards goods demand rather than services, and continued demand for export of services, particularly modern services and also the recovery in tourism. Policy should therefore focus on rebuilding policy space, particularly fiscal policy buffers, while anchoring inflation expectations. And further ahead, growth remains below pre-pandemic trend. And for the region to be able to boost this, we would support a promotion of productive investments, and especially those who that can look into sustainable development and also promote more inclusive growth going forward. On that note, let me pass you on to the structural issues that Marty would cover.
Good evening, everyone. Let me now turn to the second part, focusing on the thematic chapter. This year's thematic chapter, we focus on three major trends: aging, global trade reconfiguration, and rapid technological change. So these three are interacting in complex ways that is making the region's long-term growth path, including Singapore's, more opaque. But before that, it's important to highlight that the region has achieved immense economic progress in the last 2 decades. It is now a significant contributor of global growth, as you can see in the left chart, and it not has only experienced higher, but also more stable growth compared to other parts of the world. In fact, all 14 economies in ASEAN+3 has moved to at least middle income status in recent decades, which is the point of the right chart. However, what we're finding is that the forces that facilitated this growth are now dissipating, and as we've heard from Kat, headwinds are also rising. So we've found that the pace of growth and productivity improvements in ASEAN+3 has been slowing, especially since the global financial crisis. And so is the speed of our catch up with our high income peers, which is the point of the left chart. Now, more importantly, this slowdown is happening in an environment that is increasingly uncertain and faced with multiple structural headwinds. So we conducted a survey with our membership in AMRO, comprised of central banks and ministries of finance last October, and we identified 4 pressing structural challenges. That's led by the ongoing trade and investment reconfiguration, followed by climate change, rapid technological transformation, as well as aging. Last year, we focused exclusively on climate change. So for this year's thematic chapter, we are following up with the other 3, starting with aging. So aging is happening faster in ASEAN+3 than in many parts of the world. In fact, last year, working populations in 9 of our economies have already peaked, and the total working population in the region is projected to decline in the next 5 years. A key driver of this trend are declining fertility rates. So the average fertility rate in ASEAN+3 is at 1.4, and that's well below the replacement level of 2.1. In fact, by 2035, all our economies will have sub-replacement rates except for one country, which is the Philippines. So Singapore actually was the first one in ASEAN to see the share of its working population shrink in 2010. It not only has the lowest fertility rate in ASEAN now, but it's also included in the top 30 economies globally with the lowest fertility rates. So now, why is this an issue? At the current pace of aging in the region, the problem of becoming old before becoming rich is an issue for our many middle-income economies. So if you can see at the left chart, the x-axis represents the pace of aging, the y-axis represents wealth. As you can see here, Singapore up top, Hong Kong, Japan have been aging at relatively high levels of income at about $30,000 per capita at least. But if you notice, Malaysia, China, and Thailand are also moving along the x-axis, but at per capita incomes less than $20,000. So the issue is that some economies may have less resources to manage the challenges that aging brings, which is highlighted in the right chart, starting from lower growth potential up to risks to fiscal and financial stability, especially if there are no offsetting policies put in place. Now, while it is true that the region is aging faster, a point we make in our thematic chapter is that we can dampen and delay the effects of demographic changes. And this is because while the region is aging, our populations are also living longer and healthier, which is the point of the left chart. In fact, Singapore's population can be considered as healthier than in most advanced economies. So if we are to allow people who want to and are able to remain meaningfully productive even at an older age, then we can reap the benefits of this longer life, what we call the longevity dividend. So in our report, we estimated that if we take into account this older but healthier population, that could mean about 200 million workers re-entering the region's workforce by 2050. So allowing Since to age productively could delay the peak of the working population to next decade and also minimize the impact of a rapidly shrinking labor supply. So this older but healthier trend is actually evident in Singapore as well, where the average Singaporean can now expect to live 4 to 5 times longer than in 2000. So we did a similar exercise for Singapore, and this older but healthier population analysis shows that there could be about 1 million workers re-enter Singapore's workforce by mid-century. But of course, this outcome is not guaranteed. So policy would have to play a crucial role to ensure that this longevity dividends materialize. In the report, we do highlight that we need to shift from merely responding to the challenge of aging to maximizing the benefits of a healthier but older workforce. Of course, that would require a multi-pronged approach that encompasses several aspects of public policy, as you can see in this table. And that includes pension reforms, the use of technology, and international cooperation. So what we found with Singapore's aging-related policies, it is providing a good example for many in the region to learn from. And another point that we highlight is that while aging initially seems to be a domestic issue, it does have significant cross-border implication and thus requires international cooperation. Let me now move on to the second trend that we look at in the chapter, which is trade reconfiguration. So globally, we found 3 key trends underpinning these changes. First, the increasing role of geopolitics in realigning global trade. As you can see in the left chart, China and US trade with each other is slowing, but their trade with the rest of the world is growing. Second, in the middle chart, there are signs that global trade is becoming more concentrated. That means that more countries are trading with less partners compared to previous decades. Third, services is becoming an important driver of global trade. As you can see in the right chart, services trade has been growing much faster than cross-border trade in goods. Now, each of these trends are also happening in ASEAN+3. So first, ASEAN in particular has been able to benefit and position themselves as additional link between China and the US. So when we look at China's value-added exports to the US that goes through third-party economies, we actually see ASEAN continuing to increase its share or role as an indirect exporter of China's value added. And that's the gray line here in the left chart. Now, Singapore is also such a beneficiary, especially when we talk about services. So Singapore's share as an indirect exporter of China's manufacturing has actually declined over the years, which is a broken gray line, but it remains a key conduit of services between China and the US, which are the rising red lines here up top, especially when it comes to business sector services and finance. In the middle chart, we also find that ASEAN+3's trade portfolios have becoming less diversified in recent decades. Of course, that reflects stronger intra-regional linkages in the region, especially with China. But we highlight that too high concentration can reduce the resilience of our supply chains. Third, we also find that the region's services trade has grown much faster than goods, which you can see with the higher green line at the right chart than the red line. Of course, again, as Catherine has mentioned, this is driven by modern services, those that can be delivered digitally. But we find that modern services is only about 5% of the region's total exports. Singapore is already a key player in services trade, given its role as a hub and finance center. And this is one point that we make in the report. Modern services has shown to be resilient to external shocks. And we also highlight how it can be potentially a silver lining for trade in the region amid the shifting trade environment. Now, while we have identified these major trends, the fact is the future of globalization is really uncertain. So from where we are right now, current state, one potential scenario is a more fragmented global economy, especially if protectionism goes unchecked, with negative implications on growth and trade. But another scenario we can imagine is one where there is broader or deeper globalization or reglobalization. And in this scenario, of course, the risk to growth would be minimized. But given this very unclear landscape, it is essential for our economies to identify and implement strategies that would reinforce growth regardless of the future outcome, whether the world is more fragmented or not. And this is what we highlight in the report. We have identified a few of these strategies in the chapter, and those includes enhancing your domestic competitiveness and industrial capacity, expanding your trade in services, and pursuing broader economic integration. For example, finding new markets and new products. Now, going on to the third trend that we discuss in the chapter, we have a longer section on this, but let me just highlight our key findings in the next two slides before I wrap up with our key messages. So technology has long been key in driving ASEAN+3's growth. We actually are housing some of the world's most innovative economies in the region, which is the point of this left chart. However, what we found is there is significant heterogeneity in ASEAN+3 with widely differing technological capabilities within and between economies, as you can see in the right. Now, moving forward, we know that technology will continue to play a key role and it will generate growth opportunities for the region, increasing our productivity and creating new products, as you can see here in the left. But it will also unlock solutions to many of the structural headwinds we are facing, which is the point of the middle chart. So frontier technologies like biotechnology and robotics would help us respond to the challenges of aging, while blockchain, Internet of Things, would help us respond to the challenges of trade reconfiguration. However, for this to materialize, we highlight that what we would need is a broader knowledge diffusion across our economies, simultaneously improving our infrastructure, soft and hard, and more importantly, really reducing the digital divide within and between our economies. Now, given the increasing interest in generative artificial intelligence, or Gen AI, the technology behind ChatGPT, we also look at what this potentially means for the region. So Gen AI is raising legitimate concerns on job displacement. But from our review, what we find is there could be a cause for qualified optimism. So we look at the exposure of the region's jobs to Gen AI based on what tasks are comprised on that job. So our purpose here is not to predict precisely the impact of Gen AI, but to provide insights on how jobs could evolve given this technology. So Gen AI exposure can happen in two ways, right? It can automate our jobs, or it can enhance our jobs or augment us, enhance our efficiency as workers, and reduce barriers to labor productivity. So the good news is what we found in our study is that more jobs in the region would be augmented rather than automated. And that's represented by the generally longer green bars than the red parts in the left chart. However, the impact will vary across skills level and gender. So for Singapore, in the right chart, high-skilled jobs will benefit more from Gen AI's augmentation, but middle-skilled jobs are at risk of job automation from the technology. So similarly, women's jobs, right at the bottom, will be affected more than male employment, and that's because of the larger share of female employment in sectors that will be affected by Gen AI. So in the report, we highlight that policies to create a supportive environment to upskill and reskill workers is important to make sure that the workforce can make the most out of Gen AI while minimizing potential inequalities. Now, let me summarize our key messages for this chapter. Without a doubt, of course, the ASEAN+3's future has never been more complex, made more opaque by these three structural shifts. The rapid pace of aging is raising doubts about our long-term growth prospects, but as I have mentioned, we do have populations that are living longer and healthier with potentially longer productive lives. So Singapore, in some ways, is providing a good pathway for many in ASEAN+3 to maximize this longevity. We also looked at three forces underpinning the changes in global trade landscape, including the rising role of geopolitics and services trade. Again, given the very uncertain landscape of trade, it is a need for ASEAN+3, including Singapore, to prioritize policies that are robust to multiple possible futures. And lastly, technology will continue to play a key role for ASEAN+3, both as a solution and as a catalyst of change. So faced with Gen AI and similar technologies, a balanced approach at the current juncture would be sensible. So let me end the presentation with our policy recommendations. So the three trends you've seen earlier, as I've highlighted, they do bring a variety of risks, but well-designed, timely policies can transform them into opportunities. So we do have a longer discussion of this in our report, but across those various policies, we actually find four common themes. So the first one is really expanding and deepening quality infrastructure. Second is really encouraging innovation and knowledge diffusion. Third is promoting inclusion. And fourth is really championing and supporting multilateral cooperation. So we find that these underlying strategies, they would help basically reinforce the foundation on which economy-specific policies can be built, including Singapore, and successfully help the region as a whole navigate the future. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Mate, for that very succinct and very comprehensive view of where the region stands now and the forces shaping the immediate future. So we are precisely on time. Thank you very much to the presenters. So let's go for a quick coffee and reassemble just maybe a couple of minutes before 11:15. Yeah, thank you. Okay, great. Very disciplined. Moderator is strict. Huh? Okay, welcome back, everyone. So why don't we move into the panel discussion? And what I'd like to do is to first ask Hunting and Erica to present their views, maybe for about 10 minutes each, and then we'll open up. We're already getting some good questions from the online audience, so I'd encourage you all to think of a few more questions, and then we'll go ahead. So maybe what Hunting wants to go first? Thank you.
Testing. Thanks, ESS and AREO, ASEC for organizing this event. It's my pleasure to be invited on this panel. So I think we've seen quite interesting presentations earlier by AREO on the cyclical issues and the structural issues. And perhaps let me start off with the cyclical side of things first. So I think I agree with AMRO's assessment of stronger ASEAN growth in 2024. And I think from DBS perspective, as we entered 2024 this year, we actually expect 2024 to be a better year for ASEAN 6 growth. So personally, I cover ASEAN, the ASEAN region with a focus on Singapore. So look at it quite closely. And we hold quite a cautiously optimistic outlook for the ASEAN region. So in fact, I think our forecasts are quite similar to AMRO, where we expect GDP growth to improve to 4.7% in 2024, up 50 basis points from 2023. And we see quite similar growth drivers actually. I think first of all, there was this focus on the electronic cycle, and we are seeing some turnaround. But I must say, for ASEAN electronic cycle, it's actually not that plugged into AI. So in fact, for Singapore, the recovery on the electronic side has been quite bumpy in the first quarter, as we have seen. But as the recovery broadens out, I think we should see some recovery there that would support Singapore's manufacturing sector. Secondly, I think the point that we have talked about was tourism, and that would continue to provide a lift to the region. I think so far the revival has been quite encouraging, and I think one point that we haven't really spoken about is the return of Chinese tourists, and that is probably quite important for certain economies like Vietnam, Thailand, and Singapore. So, for example, Vietnam, I think we've seen recover above that of the pre-pandemic rates, and Singapore, Thailand has also done quite reasonably well. And I think for Singapore, some effect has also been helped by the Taylor Swift event, which has lifted up Singapore's tourism numbers at the very least. So I think these are two reasons to be optimistic about for the region. But like what Emerald said in the race, there are certain risks to watch out for. And certainly, I think one of which would be perhaps more so for 2025 than 2024 is what would be the impact of the US elections, and in that sense, perhaps a base case where Trump is elected as president again should not be discounted. So perhaps I can stop my comments here and pass to Erica.
Thanks, Hunting. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Manu, and good morning, Ambassador. I'm very happy to be here. If my grad school was anything near as wonderful as this, I might have attended classes more diligently. So commenting on the structural part that Marty presented, I would like to make three short points. Right, one point which everyone knows for a fact. The second point you can probably agree with, and the third point you may not be aware of. So first, as Marty presented, we notice supply chains spreading beyond China from two sources of companies, right? So one which was covered was the China Plus One strategy that a lot of MNCs are adopting, right, to de-risk outside of China. And then the second trend that we also notice is Chinese MNCs, right, from electronic firms to EV firms to e-commerce giants are also diversifying from China to pursue other blue ocean markets because in China is getting very competitive, intensely competitive. So China Inc. as a whole, whether it's SOEs or the private sector, are moving from made in China to made by China in the rest of the world. And the second point that I would like to make that you may or may not agree with is that Southeast Asia is a beneficiary of this trend of trade or supply chain reconfiguration. And the third point that I would like to make is that Southeast Asia is becoming a victim of this supply chain reconfiguration. So second point, Southeast Asia being a beneficiary, I think you have seen that playing out in real life in the last 24 months, right? So companies from all parts of the geopolitical spectrum or divide are committing to setting up plants in Malaysia, in Thailand, in Indonesia, to take advantage of their resource endowments, number one, and also to pursue their large domestic markets, right? And as a result, I think recently we made Hapin and I and the team made a trip to Iskandar in Malaysia, and we were so amazed to see broad swathes of land being devoted to data centers and American owned data centers sitting side by side with Chinese run data centers, right? And you see the same thing happening in Thailand as well, right? So Thailand has auto plants from BYD and then also from BMW, from Ford. Yeah, so I think ASEAN is able to attract these sorts of FDI and benefit because of its relative neutrality, right? So you may or may not realize it, but ASEAN economies or a few ASEAN economies adopt this philosophy, this ancient philosophy of diplomacy, which in Chinese we call 合纵连横. 合纵连横 is it came from the warring states 2,700 years ago, right? Which 合纵连横 basically means small states should stick together. Number one, that's 合纵. 连横 means small states should build cordial relations with the two largest superpowers. Right, so to maintain a balance of cordial relations, and I think ASEAN has pretty much found itself in that sweet spot, right? And some ASEAN countries also have sizable local markets that make them very attractive to FDI. Maybe not Singapore, but definitely Vietnam, Indonesia, right? Malaysia, Thailand. and the Philippines as well. Another attractive part is that unit labor costs in many parts of ASEAN are still, close to or below that of China's. So a very attractive place to diversify, whether it's the China Plus One companies or Chinese companies. Now, how would ASEAN end up becoming collateral damage in this supply chain configuration? So our team did some studies, and we found that, with trade tensions brewing, especially, in the run-up to the U.S. presidential elections, you see a lot of tariff and non-tariff actions, right? Protectionist actions from the U.S. already. We also could see further protectionist actions from the EU towards Chinese-made goods, right? So there is a risk that the Chinese goods might end up being directed to Southeast Asian markets, which can also crowd out local supply, right? So that might, lend a deflationary shock. And I think a less noticed reason why ASEAN might become a victim of the trade tensions as a result of being a receptacle to Chinese FDI is that, gradually you're seeing developed market governments saying that Chinese firms are setting up and using Southeast Asian plants as finishing bases, right? So they, slap on a coat of paint on the car and then ship it. And so I think, already in the solar space, the American government is investigating and taking action against Vietnam, Malaysia, Thai, and Cambodian solar exports because they are believed to have, more than substantial value add from China and less value add from the host country of the plant. So I think the key to, I think Southeast Asian countries must be careful to include enough local content in their production, so that they don't get caught in this crossfire between different economic powers. So what are the responses? I think ASEAN integration will be a very important response. So you can see that coming into action in the the Johor Singapore Special Economic Zone. So we're actually breaking down barriers to trade, labor movement, and that combines our resource endowments to become a more a stronger receptacle of economic activity and not just merely a finishing base that adds on that final coat of paint. Yep, that's all my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Again, very succinct presentations by Hanteng and Rika. I'd like to open now to discussion. Maybe while you're formulating any of your own questions, I'll just pose a couple of questions to the panel. I think it strikes me, at least when we start with the conjunctural view, the big swing factor in the near-term outlook is China, right? And what we've seen in the last few weeks is a clear sense of urgency in the policy response by Chinese policymakers, particularly the big move on the property sector for banks to be funded to help local governments buy up excess property and so on. So what's your view, maybe first with AMRO and then with the others? Is this sufficient? Or do we need to see a much stronger policy response before we can be confident that China is really on the right track?
Thanks, Manu. So China is an interesting point, and this is where I must say right now, just off the bat, we are quite confident that the measures that the government is undertaking right now is sufficient to support growth and is sufficient to at least give us a sustained growth for this year. So at the moment, we think they're on track. They're doing what they should be doing, and supporting the property sector from further downturn or further deceleration is the right move that they should be undertaking. But I'll also point out that if you were to look across the different IOs, you would find that our view actually differs from the IMF in terms of even the trend, or even from the ADB, in that for this year, we're actually projecting a sustained growth for China from 5.2 last year to 5.3% this year. And this is contrary to, say, the IMF or ADB, who are projecting from 4.5 to 4.8%. And a big difference in terms of our assumption here is our baseline assumption on this property sector correction. So in our view, at least for our Chinese team's view, is that China's property sector has seeing a turning point sometime this year, and growth is stabilizing in terms of property sector. We're not saying that it's going to completely recover immediately, but we're saying it's stabilizing. I think we differ from some of the reports that you might see out there. But having said that, we do see some growth revision coming from private sector analysts recently, who have also revised their growth forecast to about 5 to 5.2%. So broadly, I think we're pretty confident that Chinese growth would at least be sustained, that the property sector is stabilizing, and the measures that the government is doing is on the right track to supporting the industry.
Okay.
Thank you.
Erica or Hunter, you want to come in on that? Erica, I think you have something.
Maybe to just address the slew of property market rescue measures that were rolled out on Friday. Some of it was to lower the down payment ratios, right, for first homes from 20 to 15%, and then for second homes from 30 to 25%. And then the other large one that attracted headlines was the government announcing that it's going to move in to soak up excess unsold inventory from developers. So I think in terms of how effective, the devil is in the details. So number one, in terms of trying to prop up home buyer demand, I think home buyers are unlikely to respond very much to the lowering of the minimum down payment, primarily because the home buyers that are going to be lured out of the woodwork, right, by the 5 percentage point fall in down payments are those that couldn't otherwise afford in the first place. So I think the marginal impacts are minimal. As to the government's plan to buy unsold housing inventory, with the first salvo, 300 billion yuan seems a lot, but the entire stock of unsold housing inventory completed and uncompleted is about 20 million homes, amounting to about 30 trillion yuan. So the first salvo is about 1% of the entire stock of inventory. We think probably something nearer to 10 trillion yuan will be needed to bring inventories back to pre-pandemic levels. And secondly, I think there was this ominous statement by the Vice Premier He Lifeng that said they will step in to buy the inventory at reasonable prices. So if they only buy at steeply discounted prices, this would lower the market value of all the existing stock of flats and could contribute to more homes entering negative equity. And Chinese people by nature, they don't walk away from their loans just because it's a negative equity. So that might actually, if they continue to meet their obligations, that might actually crimp the consumption outlook for China going forward.
Thank you. So I guess on our house view on China, we actually expect the Chinese authorities to be able to meet its 5% target for this year just by the performance that we have seen so far. But I guess one point to note is that the numbers that we are seeing have been quite skewed. So in the sense that it's being supported by the industrial side of things rather than the retail or consumer side of activities. So in that sense, the recovery is still quite uneven, although I think some of the measures that are being put in place by the authorities to stem the property decline would it's gradually would take some effect and help to stabilize the property market. And perhaps with the stabilization of the property market, then we could see some of the confidence of consumers start to stabilize as well. But I think near-term wise, perhaps some stabilization, but structurally, I think they are still facing quite a number of challenges, including aging, which was one of the topics that's being discussed today.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Maybe we'll focus on the cyclical conjunctural issues first. Are there any questions in that area before we move on from anyone?
So my question is, with China as one and Chinese companies coming in, how will it affect, for example, enterprises, be it the small, medium, and the larger enterprises, and which do you think will benefit more, from startup investments or trade exposures?
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's a very profound question. I think to answer what's happening to Singapore, let me use the example of what's happening in Thailand's auto industry. So, Thailand's auto industry, has welcomed 8 Chinese EV makers to set up shop so far. And I think, the plants are coming live, right? Making about 1,200 EVs already last month. And what's happened during the shift is that, thousands of SMEs, Thailand-owned SMEs that used to supply parts to the ICE auto industry, right? Toyota, Mazda, they are getting disintermediated, maybe not intentionally, right? So the local content of an ICE car in Thailand was about 70%. EVs, right now I understand it to be at steady state about 30%. And it's not quite there yet because of 2 reasons, right? One is structurally, you just can't cut and paste ICE components to an EV, right? They just don't need exhaust pipes, for instance. So some can move over, some can't be helped. And secondly, the SMEs in Thailand are still unable to be plugged into the supply chain of the Chinese giants, which have their own supply chains, their own relationships, their own specifications. So I think it will take time. We know whenever a big player comes in from any country, for the ecosystem to gradually catch up and build those relationships, win those contracts.
Thank you. Yes.
Southeast Asia, because it's more focused on those high small trips. Now, in which way is Southeast Asia going to catch up and get back into adding to this and this area of growth? What do you see?
Who wants to take that?
Thanks for the question. So I guess I think structurally, some of, say for example, Singapore, it's been more skewed towards memories, for example. How I think this would, allow Singapore, for example, to catch up would be, say, I think just on the cyclical part of it, where some of the data centers or use of computers require more of these memories, then you could see the cycle broadening. But in terms of investments wise, that would require the specific ASEAN country to attract these AI related companies. So for example, I think NVIDIA and NVIDIA is looking to invest in Vietnam or Singapore for that matter. And in that sense, that still requires some of these factors that would encourage these big companies to come to invest in this region. So at the end of the day, it would probably depend on the business environment or the amount of skilled talent that they have, which would encourage these companies to come to these ASEAN companies. Perhaps just to follow up on that earlier question, in terms of China plus one trends coming into Singapore, I think just looking at the fixed asset investment data that's been coming in fact, it's the global names that is trying to diversify their supply chain and coming into Singapore to invest. So companies like Global Foundries, for example. In terms of Chinese companies, I think they are looking at Singapore more so as a hub for the rest of the region based on some of the clients we are talking to. So perhaps to set up a hub in Singapore for logistics and how that could serve, say, a bigger market in Indonesia or the rest of the region. So I think that's some of the trends that we are seeing for this China plus one diversification into Singapore.
Marty, you wanted to comment?
So just to follow up on your question on AI, from our near-term point of view, it's really more of a timing, right? So the global chip cycle that we're seeing now, which is going up, is really driven by this demand for AI and more advanced chips. And most of that demand is really going to, say, Japan, Korea, Taiwan province of China. But for the Southeast Asian manufacturers, which are more focused on the mature chips or legacy, then that just means that the recovery is a bit more late. So we, in our conversations with some private sector, they find that the turnaround once the more advanced chips demand come about, it takes about 6 to 9 months for mature chips, those at the back end, to actually turn around. So even if we see the global chip cycle starting to recover now, the actual materialization for Southeast Asian exports would come maybe 2 or 3 quarters down the line. So it's not like AI growing is just benefiting the more advanced manufacturers, but actually the back end is also, it's just a bit late in that coming. So in that sense, for our outlook on exports, that would still have tailwinds until the next year coming from this demand for chips and not just for AI. And I guess just to follow up on your point on this difference between SMEs and large manufacturers benefiting from the influx of Chinese investments. So Eric has given some flavor on Thailand, and maybe I can give some flavor on Malaysia's electronic sector. We did do a visit there to basically learn, okay, how is the electronic sector benefiting from this influx? And one point that was highlighted there really is, aside from trying to get the FDI for the large enterprises, there's really a need for the entrepreneurship to be encouraged for the SMEs. So that would require really an ecosystem that supports all these small enterprises and allowing this diffusion of technology knowledge from the large ones into the small ones, especially since, as Erica said, timing is everything in this supply chain. You need to build trust on your supplier. So it does take time. And that building of trust comes if you have a well-established ecosystem, that you have several partners from the government, the academia, as well as in the private sector. And that way you can push even the smaller enterprises to take part, even in very small segments of the supply chain, right? Even just producing a small button. But it does require a wider ecosystem. It's hard to do it on a more separated way in this size of industry, but it's really the importance of having that environment.
Thank you. Yes. Okay.
Hi there. Thanks for this very interesting discussion. I would like for us to explore a little bit on the choice of language that we are all, as economists, defining when we talk about the changes to global supply chains that have happened. So many of us are often using words disintermediation, de-risking the supply chains. But empirically, I think there's maybe two observations that can be made. Number one, the result of all these changes of supply chains are actually lengthening. Number one. And number two, it's, I think, obvious to everybody in this room that China's manufacturing industry and role in global supply chains is basically of systemic importance for the global economy. And no matter what anybody attempts to do, that's probably not going to change for the next few decades, or maybe never. And so I wonder if actually, rather than de-risking supply chains, because they're becoming longer, we're actually increasing the risks by all these forces and policies that are beyond our reach. So, I mean, is our choice of language, does it need to be revised or changed in how we think about this? Because a lengthening of supply chains means that if you have a weather shock, if you have a global policy shock, if you have disruption in shipping routes, actually that could end up being more disruptive than perhaps even the disruption we saw during COVID-19. So just some food for thought. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on it. It's a complex question. There's a lot of there to unpack, but if anybody has any thoughts.
Basically, you're saying that the efforts to de-risk are actually self-defeating, yeah?
Yeah. If you're parts are going from China to Vietnam, then back to China, and then they're going to other parts of the world. So
that's always been the case.
Yeah.
Asian production.
Yeah, quite often the same good will cross borders several times, right? So how different is, I think that's what James is trying to say, right? Is it? Yeah. Yeah, Erica? Martin, you can.
I fully agree with the names that we give to this thing, right? We all agree that it's a thing, but is it de-risking, supply chain reconfiguration, trade reconfiguration, over capacity even? I think there's a lot of ideas wrapped into this, but I think we can all agree that something very profound, right, is happening to trade patterns and investment patterns in the last 24 months, right, that will determine the way economy, the region grows in the next 24 years. So very long-term, pivotal investment changes happening now. Yeah, so I would agree that, it might not be lowering any risk, just like I don't think that China is in any way exporting over capacity. Yeah, it's like saying that, Saudi Arabia should only produce enough crude oil for its own needs, right? Doesn't make sense. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of names being tagged on to these shifts. Yeah, it's a thing that we cannot put a name to.
Yeah. Martin?
Yeah, so this is going to really economic literature, right? So it really depends on how we define when we say lengthening. So there's a BIS study that defines lengthening as a number of customers in a client supply chain. So for example, a Chinese company that used to export directly to the US but uses Asia as exports to Asia, then that Asian company exports to the US, then they would define it as lengthening because it's an additional step. In some studies, some would say the size of China growing over time has actually shortened value chains. It absorbed a lot of value chains in China, right? So in that sense, it's producing a lot of these steps and just importing one, so it's shorter. So I think a lot of us would have different definitions. Is it lengthening? Is it shortening? Depending on which school of trade thought we want to go to. But I think Erica's point really is, it's not really the issue of lengthening, but it's more on the intent of resilience or diversification. So in the same BIS study, they did point out that even if you lengthen, it does not mean you're increasing your resilience, right? Some lengthen, okay, I'll export to Asia, who will export for me, and maybe that will not disrupt me from US tensions. But that does not automatically say you are being resilient on that supply chain. So I think to the extent that the change in supply chains is underscored by the intent of achieving resilience and more diversification to achieve this resilience, then I think regardless of really how we describe it, it's really at the end of the day, it's really more of the intention to achieve that objective. So I would say that.
But it seems like the objective is just to do less manufacturing in China. So if that's the intent, then the intent is not necessarily about resilient, right?
Yes, that's right. That's right. So that's a good point to make. So from our view, as long as the intention of achieving resilience is there, then we can diversify as much as we can, or we can focus on just one country, right? So
Is that a follow-up to this? No, do you have a follow-up? Yeah.
Strategy. In you mentioned regional possible last year, but I think that people are talking about domestic, demographic development. So if a company wants to move away from China, they're looking at various options, be it Mexico, which is nearshoring to the US and really strengthening the supply chain. They're talking about India, they're talking about ASEAN. So, how do all these locations play out? Where does ASEAN come in? Or something which the other regions don't?
Can I just supplement your question? You talked about demographic dividend, but I was just in India, and the worry there is that because of the lack of investment in health and education, the demographic dividend is actually not materializing, and therefore India may not have as much of an advantage over ASEAN as we think. But I don't know what the actual view is. What does AMRO think?
In this report, but in our other engagements over time, we have explored this discussion to say that, if people are going for resiliency and going for ASEAN plus, China plus one, why isn't that one inclusive of India? And across board, some of the feedback that we do have is that the difference between India versus ASEAN or even versus Mexico is the ecosystem that we talked about earlier for the semiconductor industry or manufacturing-based industries. Because these industries, to produce one item, you require a lot of suppliers, and these suppliers require a lot of auxiliary supporters that provide all the site services. And for ASEAN and even in Mexico, this ecosystem are quite readily available, and they are quite reliable. And we have got hundreds of years of history backing this, right? For example, Intel in Malaysia has been there for more than 100 years. They've got the know-how, they've got the skilled talent, they've got all the support system ready there. So in some of our engagements with Indian embassy and also with the Indian companies, is that India doesn't seem to have that readily as available as it's already in ASEAN. So it's not just within India itself, but also its relationship in getting all these supplies and different parts and different services and leveraging within the ecosystem that it has domestically and also with the other economies. So we think that's one area that potentially why India kind of loses out when it comes to this diversification issue.
We have one question from the online audience, so I think we should be fair to the online audience. And it's about how automation and artificial intelligence can help offset the shrinking labor force. But the concern expressed here is that would countries like Singapore, which are better enabled in terms of digital technology, perform better, and so the gap between countries will actually widen, inequality widen. You want to comment on that, please?
So we are very aware of that. And this is one thing we actually caution in our report, that already, as it is now at the current pace of digitalization, the digital divide is wide already in ASEAN+3. You have the leaders, you have Japan, Singapore, and you have the smaller economies that have at the very early stages of developing their innovative capabilities. And in this rapidly changing environment, I think what we really want to highlight is the only way to basically help reduce this divide is to really encourage knowledge diffusion across the region. And one way to do that is having your high-level FDI come into the smaller economies, but at the same time, make sure that domestic base is able to absorb that technology, right? You have capable support suppliers on the ground who are able to absorb that that knowledge from the FDI who are coming. So at the same time, while you're attracting FDI to facilitate this knowledge spillover, for example, in electronics, some of this tech, data centers, digitalization, then you also have to make sure that the local base is able to develop those ones. So that really to reduce that divide.
I've been warned that we are running out of time, but I would be remiss. Okay, let's have one more question.
Another question. Should we worry? I guess I'll preface this by saying, in recent decades, Asian economies have really stood out in the sense that policymakers have, in a comparative sense, been sort of almost fiscal hawks. Very conservative fiscal policies relative to many other parts of the world. But one concern I have is that these dynamics seem to be changing in some parts of the ASEAN+3 region. You have China being advised and continue to use local policy to support all these houses based on the property market. You have places like Thailand, which is years after the pandemic, about those for citizens. You have countries like the Philippines that put in place a medium-term fiscal targets, but seem to be delaying those targets. And what is the house view that you have on the direction, and what should be the fiscal policy approach that Asian economies in this global context that we find ourselves in?
So you're absolutely right in painting the different ways that Asian economies have been using fiscal policy. Broadly, our recommendation is that wherever you're possible, especially right now, when you've got positive growth prospects, inflation's moderating, you should conserve firepower. And you should try to build up immunity for the future if you can. But in areas where you do require policy support, where you do require government support to prop up growth, by all means, you should do it. So in that sense, that's what China is doing. That's what Thailand is trying to do. And in other cases, in the last 2 years, we have seen them use it extensively to mitigate or the impact of inflation passed through to the people. And we see where it warrants the use of fiscal support, use it judiciously, but wherever possible, you should try to consolidate, in view of your increased public debt position and also decreasing fiscal space after the pandemic. So generally, that's how we see the use of fiscal policies.
Erica, yeah, please.
So I think the number one rule of fiscal policy or monetary policy for that matter is that it should be counter-cyclical. And I think you've rightly pointed out, in China, they are thinking of ramping up fiscal stimulus. And in Thailand, there's plans to ramp up spending in some form or the other. We think that it's probably advisable to spend it on public infrastructure rather than handouts. But I think the rule stands, and it's that China and Thailand are probably two of the economies in the region that are having negative output gaps. Deflation, right? So both Thailand and China are facing deflation. And I think, the right prescription for an economy like that is to ramp up counter-cyclical spending.
Thank you. So unless any really pressing questions, I think we're running out of time. I hesitate to try and summarize the discussion, but I guess the point I would take away is that on the cyclical outlook, I think there's a general consensus that the prospects are looking reasonably bright, although there are obviously some question marks over some dark clouds. In terms of the big structural transformations, again, the impression I get is that it can largely be positive for the region, so long as the policies are in place, like skills and so on. And then in that case, then we should do well out of this. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking the panel for great contributions. And let me end by once again thanking ASEC for their hospitality in this and AMRO for their contributions. Thank you.